G'day, podcasters. Welcome back to Season 4 of True Blue Conversations. I just want to give a shout out to our show sponsor, 254 Coffee, for Troopers, by Troopers. For all your coffee needs, head to www.254.com.au. G'day! Welcome to True Blue Conversations. I'm Adam Bloom. Today's special guest is historian from the Australian War Memorial, Michael Kelly. And Michael has joined us today to talk about the Malayan Emergency and Australia's involvement. Hi Michael, thanks for joining us on the show.
Hi Adam, thank you very much for having me along.
Nah, mate, it's an absolute honour and a privilege to have you on and talk about the Malayan Emergency. And I'm right to say this, Michael. I believe that it's the forgotten conflict of post-World War II. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's certainly amongst one of the three forgotten conflicts that you could say that occurred between the end of 1945 and the Second World War and Vietnam. With you've also got Korea, plus the emergency, and then the Indonesian confrontation as well. But the emergency certainly is one of those conflicts that was a long commitment for Australia, but nobody really remembers it today.
No, that's right. So, Michael, can you give us a bit of background about you before we get into it, as you as a young fella? Where did you grow up, and what were your main interests and hobbies?
Yeah, not surprisingly, the military has always been an interest of mine. But I grew up, born in England. I grew up between South Australia and Victoria, so depending on which parent I was with. But mostly down in Victoria. I was always a pretty keen student, I guess, of history. And one of the first exposures, growing up in the 1970s and into the early 80s was the end of the Vietnam War, and then also you've got the Falklands. I mean, my first TV war as a kid was the Falklands, and watching that with Dad was something that really sparked interest in the military, but also that notion of service and people going to foreign parts and fighting in wars. And it's never really left me. It's only sort of one of those things that got built on. And now at the memorial, and I've been there nearly 20 odd years, which is been an amazing ride.
So you mentioned that you had an interest in military history from an early age. Did you have any relatives that fought and served in the military?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that's another thing that really piqued my interest as well, as growing up with the family stories of who'd served where. And two of my great uncles, my dad's side, Des Kelly, served in the 27th Battalion and then ended up as a machine gunner on the Western. He went from Gallipoli through to the Western Front. And he'd been writing letters back to his brother, one of his brothers, Gordon, telling him not to go to war. And he ended up in the 3rd Light Horse over in the desert. And his big battle was at Beersheba, and he was fighting with the 3rd Light Horse in the capture of the hill at Tel El Saba before the mounted attack went in later in the afternoon. So that was his one major battle. And I think the thing I find most amusing in his service record is at the end of the war, he got done for knocking off a saddle out of the military police lines and crime for that. So not related to the Ned Kelly brand of criminals, but he certainly raised the flag. And then the Second World War were on both mum and dad's side as well. So it's a long history of service.
And for you, you joined the military as well. You joined the army. What was the decision for you to join the army? What was your main aspiration?
There was a couple of things really. I mean, for me, I was a bit of a lost soul as a kid in a way, but always had that dream and desire to serve something bigger than myself. So I was a volunteer firefighter at age 15 in a local community and giving back that way. But just always there was that burning thing that I wanted to serve the military, and predominantly the army. And my marks were never good enough to go in as an officer, but I thought, well, where one door closes, another opens. So I went general enlistment through Kapuka and ended up as an infantryman. So again, bringing wet at 55 kilograms, everything I carried was bigger and heavier than I was, but I gave it a go.
Can you tell us a bit of what are your fondest memories of your time in the army, and what did you take away from the army going forward in your professional career?
Yeah, I think some of the things like resilience, I think, is one of the big ones. You learn to deal with some pretty rough situations, even just in training, not just the training itself, but with mates getting hurt or even killed in accidents and things like that. It really teaches you that to appreciate your life and appreciate what's around you and those who are around you helping you through as well. And that's one of the great things that I think I really brought away with me was that extra sort of shot of resilience. And you can overcome anything if you're determined enough and strong enough. So I think that's and you don't do it alone. You're always as part of a team, and that's one of the things I've always tried to do, whether it's on the sporting field playing cricket or AFL or in the army as well. I've always wanted to be part of a team and do things for that team rather than as an individual. I've never really been fond or comfortable with personal accolades or things about the self. It's always something for the greater good.
So, and I think you mentioned, you're a volunteer in as a firefighter, and I think it's camaraderie and it's mateship, and I think you've hit the nail on the head with that. You come across as that. That's what the Australian way. That's our DNA. We get in, we help people, and you help even if you don't like someone, Michael, you get in and you actually help them regardless, because that's just the Australian way, and it's exactly right.
Absolutely. And I mean, one of the first things I saw as a 15-year-old was a fatal car crash, and being on the hose whilst they were taking this body out of the wreck was one of the most confronting things I'd ever seen at that stage. And there was no trauma counselling back in that time, so I actually used my English journal at school to actually write about it. And I think I wrote about 15 pages of stuff to help process it. But it's also your fellow brigade members that are there and they've seen stuff, the older ones especially, that have seen a whole lot more stuff than this wet behind the ears kid. But actually just bringing you along and actually keeping you as part of the team, checking in on you and just making sure you're okay. That team and sense of the greater good is what really helped overcome that trauma as well. So.
Absolutely. And I think so. You finish your time in the army, and then you still had this burning desire for military history. And so, how did you come to get working at the Australian War Memorial? How did this come about for you?
It was actually my wife that got a job up in Canberra in late 2003, and we moved up at the start of 2004. And I was between jobs at that time, and I thought, well, what am I going to do? And the only thing I'd actually had desire to do, I'd missed out on a job with the visitor services team. I'd applied from Melbourne, and I didn't really have much of a CV to write home about. And I thought, well, how the hell am I going to do this? And the only place I really wanted to work when we got up to Canberra was the War Memorial. I thought, what a plum job to try and land that. So I got a job at a major retail outlet for a week and was hating it. And I made a couple of calls and found a casual employment agency that ran in recruitment rounds to get into the memorial. And so I chucked in my full-time job and went casual and worked on the floor in visitor services. And then 9 months later, I'm in there permanently. So it was just that enthusiasm and just keenness to be part of, something bigger than myself, something where I can tell veteran stories and put a love of history to work. And I've been there ever since.
So throughout the years, obviously, you said you've been there 20 years now.
Nearly 19 years.
Oh, sorry, nearly 19. And so have you had a wide variety of jobs in that time? Or
yeah, I have. Yeah, I sort of started at the floor level, quite literally as a visitor services person. So welcoming, dealing with members of the public, forward-facing sort of role with veterans and all those sort of things as well, which was always great. So dealing with that sort of thing with Anzac Day and what have you with that. And then I got a job full-time with our security team. And I'll always remember, this is sort of a bit of an aside, but the day I got full-time was September 2004. And that weekend I went down to the MCG and watched Port Adelaide give Brisbane one on the nose for their first premiership. So it's one of those watershed weekends where everything went right. So got a full-time job at the place I wanted to be at, and your footy team wins the premiership. So, but it was just one of those things that then working in security, I was there for about 9 months before I went back out into the visitors team because I was a bit more comfortable out in that environment. And then worked a bit in the bookshop, again, dealing with public and always that sort of forward facing. And then late 2007, got a gig to go over and work in one of the curatorial teams with heraldry and technology. And I've been in that sort of exhibitions and history sort of space ever since then. So March next year, I'll bring up 10 years in the history team. So I've worked in the heritage technology, worked in exhibitions on Second World War, First World War exhibitions. I've done a stack of my own little mini exhibitions on the Korean War and Malaya and Vietnam. And next year I'll be going back into the exhibitions team in a small way as well to work on some of the Iraq bits and pieces as well. So, but working in history, I've had a great chance to work on wartime, work in the Korean and post-45 Asia space, and make a contribution that way. So it's been a really proud time.
Well, I understand that you are considered a post 1945 conflict historian specialising in Australia's involvement in the Korean War. Can you tell us what is it about the period after the Second World War that interests you and is your passion?
Yeah, I think one of the things I find absolutely fascinating is just looking at how busy Asia is at the end of the Second World War and just what's going on. I mean, you've got the end of empires in Asia. So you're looking at the end of the British, the Dutch, the French, the rise of communism and the rise of Asian nations in amongst that as well. And it's just and seeing Australia's part within that is, I find, absolutely fascinating and continue to do so. And it's one of those things that really piqued my interest as a kid, looking at predominantly Vietnam, as you do when Vietnam got that massive resurgence in the late 80s, through the movies like Platoon and Full Metal Jacket and things like that. And as a sort of wet behind the ears high school student going, oh, great film, but hang on, there's more to this. These are actually real stories being told through fictional films. And then just really starting to delve into that, and then looking at Korea, Malaya, and Indonesia confrontation as well, and going, well, it's not just Vietnam. There's bigger stories here as well, and that just set me off on a journey which has been most of my life, and yeah, it's not overdone.
No, it's still going, mate. And so after the Pacific War ended in late 1945, can you give us an idea of the geographical situation in Southeast Asia and Australia's interest and alliances at that time?
Yeah, I mean, looking at, again, as I was saying, with the decolonisation of empires, the French are wanting to come back into Vietnam and recolonize or reclaim their colony, and the Vietnamese, who've had quite enough of the French and also the Japanese, don't want that. And so, September 1945, Ho Chi Minh declares the Republic of Vietnam in Hanoi, and you've also got the division of Korea as well at 38th parallel in 1945, which then becomes the northern and southern zones. And then in 1948, you've got North and South Korea being declared as well. 47, you've got the rise or the Pakistan forms. There's all these things going on. Indonesia starting to form, and Britain has also gone back in. They've sent troops into Vietnam as well, just to sort of be a placeholder for the French, and the Vietnamese have a bit of a crack at them. But then you've also got the British going back into Malaya in 45 as well. But there's not enough public servants to actually get a non-military government going. So they have a British military authority, which basically polarizes the Malays to sort of go, we don't want you people back here either. And that gets the nationalist movement well and truly going there too. So there's all these really big movements of nationalism from within Asia and the rise of these nations to kick out their oppressors and have their own states. And Australia is looking at this in 1945, going, well, there's so much activity going up north of our borders. We need to shore this up somehow. And they start looking at this forward defensive outlook. They're trying to keep Britain in Asia, and Britain is actually doing anything but try to stay. They want to disappear. Their main interests more in the Middle East. And America is sort of in and out of Asia, and they're not really sort of quite committed yet. But Australia, after this, with the Second World War and its reliance on American material and manpower, they're wanting to keep America in Asia as well. So, and then you start to see the rise of things like ANZUS and CETO and things like that, and the various strategic reserve in 55. So Australia is very much aware that it's a lonely outpost surrounded by some potential big conflict spots to its north. So is really trying to shore up its own security in amongst that as well.
So, Michael, how would you describe the Australian Army's military capabilities during the late 1940s and early 1950s?
By 1948, the military capabilities of Australia is utterly woeful. I mean, from having hundreds of thousands of people in uniform in 1945 to basically not even a full battalion amongst the 3 battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment that exist at this stage. 77 Squadron is the only squadron in Japan, and the Air Force is basically Carter staff and flight schools and things like that back in Australia. And the Navy still has vessels on the water, and there's HMAS Shoalhaven and Bataan in Japan when the Korean War kicks off. But there's still that sort of, the Navy is probably the biggest part of our military at that stage. But by the late 1940s, we're in a pretty dire way. And if it wasn't for the Korean War and the installation or the emergence of, or the need for K-Force, which is calling for the volunteers to come back to the colours for a 3-year period with a service year in Korea, the Australian Army would have almost had to fold and go back to being a volunteer force again. So it was looking pretty dire in that regard. But and then from 1950 onwards, they're stretched as far as the eye can see to try and actually cover the conflicts we get involved in. So it's pretty nuts.
So, is that, Michael, because the Second World War went for so long, or is it war weariness, or what is the actual, what's the main reason that a lot of the men came back from the Second World War and didn't choose to stay in the army? They got out. What is it?
I think the AIF was a volunteer force, so when they're getting out of the army at the end of the war, if they haven't actually, some of them haven't signed up for the occupation forces in Japan, they're going home and demobbing and getting out and returning to civilian lives because they're civilian soldiers. And if it's not that wasn't their permanent job, they get out. But some choose to stay in and go to Japan as part of that occupation force, and they don't get out till they're kicked out right at the end of their lives or at the end of their service, basically, or they retire. But yeah, it's basically war weariness. It's a long war. They're a volunteer organisation, and they get out at the end, and basically the government is then trying to recoup as much of the costs that it's cost them financially to keep troops in the field, Air Force, Navy, and in the field. They're trying to draw down the military and actually use that money elsewhere at home as well. So the military, all 3 service arms, get really heavily hit, and as a result of that as well, become quite the ghosts of their former selves in their glory days of sort of 39, 45.
So is that, you mentioned that they had the K Force so is that where the national servicemen came into that? Like, is that the beginning of that period, or?
No, national service does have several iterations, and there is national service in Australia, but they're not allowed to send them overseas. Kind of like what you see with the prior to the Second World War, and when they do send militia away, they're technically defending Australian sovereign territory, so they're sent to New Guinea and things like that. But because this is a foreign war, the national servicemen in that early scheme don't get sent away to Korea. They volunteer for K-Force, or they transfer into the regular army for their 6-year stint, and off they go, sort of thing. So it's the national service, whilst is retaining or training troops at home, they're not deployed and not deploying.
So it's very different to the later Vietnam, when they were called up to go over and fight over in Vietnam.
Yeah, and even then, national service was brought in 1964 as part of the. But looking at the Indonesia confrontation, confrontation was the conflict that was worrying the Australians most at that period of time, and so 4 RAR, which had been a training battalion, is activated, and national servicemen go to the confrontation as our first deployment of national servicemen, and then that's broadened when they realise actually Vietnam's going to be bigger than Ben-Hur, and then they start expanding the battalions from 4 to 9. Over the next few years, and send them off to Vietnam in turn. So national service then becomes the thing for Vietnam, but its involvement with the confrontation is what is also forgotten about as well. So our first NASHOs are in combat in 66 with 4 RAR in Indonesia.
Oh wow, that's something that I wasn't aware of, mate. I thought they came in a lot later, but yeah, there you go. So it's an interesting. That's probably another podcast that we could talk
Certainly
about.
is.
So,
Yeah.
but we're here today, as I mentioned, we're here to talk about the Malayan Emergency, and it's another very important and key topic that we talk about, and it's an interest of yours. And can you give us some background into the Malayan Emergency, and when did it begin, and who was involved, and what was the main causes?
Yeah, I think Britain inadvertently was the main cause, trying to extract itself out of Malaya post 45. But I mean, you can go back as far as even looking at the early sort of 20s and that early rise of communism in Asia, and the Malayan Communist Party becoming the one of the, and this is pretty much purely Chinese run. So it comes down in Malaysia to the ethnic lines. The local Malay people were not. I mean, that's broken up into 12. I think it's 12 sort of mini kingdoms within Malaysia or Malaya at the time, and they're predominantly Muslim. But the British, when they came in earlier for the mining and with the tin and the rubber and things like that, they brought Chinese labourers in, and so many labourers have come in that they're almost matching the population of the local Malay people. And it's there's that animosity between the two, that the Chinese who've come in as labourers don't want to be ruled by Malays. They're happy under the British, or happy enough. But there's that simmering tension even before the Second World War. And during the Second World War, the Chinese fight the Japanese in a guerrilla sense, which is supported by the British throughout as well. And it's after the war, that the Malayan Japanese or Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army so-called disarms. They cache a whole lot of weapons for future use. They're well and truly expecting to go again in some form or another. So they cache a stack of weapons and hand in a whole lot of others to make it look like they're disarming. But Britain inadvertently sort of causes this schism between the Chinese and the Malayans by offering to get a Malayan federation going in 1946 with equal citizenship to the Chinese, which the Malayan people aren't really happy with, and their nationalist movement really starts to harden up at that stage. But the fact that the Chinese aren't really going to be included, it gets their noses out of joint, and they start to agitate. Not only in the mining sense, they start to foment rebellion in a way. They start protests, going the heavy with miners and plantation owners, and it really starts to ramp up in 1948. And in June 1948, when three British plantation managers, estate managers in Perak are murdered, this is when the emergency begins proper. And so within by the 18th of June, there's the emergency's been declared for all of Malaya. But both sides really aren't prepared in any way, shape, or form for this conflict to take off or even escalate. So 48 finds the British still trying to figure out what's going on and how they're trying to run this federation or save face in a way and get a different brand of federation going. The communists are trying to destabilize all of that and actually insert themselves as the major player in Malaya, sorry, at the time. And it just devolves from there. So, it's just one of those things that there are so many different causes, I guess you could say, that you could be here for hours and write another thesis that so many other people have done just on those causations alone. But it's the British mishandling of the ideas of federation, but also the ideas of the communists wanting to really be the dominant power in Malaya as well.
So, why did Australia get involved in the conflict, and when were the first troops deployed?
Yeah, this is really interesting as well, because in 48, you've still got the Chifley Labor government in power at the time. And you've got basically the Labor Party seeing the Malayan Emergency as a bit of an internal struggle. So they don't really get involved initially. So 48 to 50, there's no real involvement. There's interest from Australia, but not in any way, shape, or form of military support. And it's only in 1950, in June 1950, when we start to commit a flight of Dakota transport aircraft. And part of one squadron, RAAF, with Lincoln bombers to the conflict as it starts to escalate. And by this time, it's the Menzies government, the Chifley government's toppled 49. And even Menzies isn't that keen to get involved in Malaya because he's looking at the British and what's going on in the Middle East, and with an eye on the Middle East. So we don't have a real heavy commitment to Malaya initially. And as we know, the same month, the Korean War kicks off. So every part of our major military focus and our commitment to the United Nations goes straight to Korea. So 3RAR, 77 Squadron, our warships, it's all going into the Korean waters with a bit of an idea of trying to defend the home front as well, which is we just don't have the forces. But so it's basically a half flight of 36 Squadron with Dakotas, not quite the entire squadron either of one squadron flying the old Lincolns, and a small commitment of troops just to go and see what's going on in Malaya and provide advice on jungle training and things like that. So it's largely a British affair, or it's entirely a British affair from 48 to 50. And it's very badly mishandled by the British as well because there's no director of operations. They're trying to do these big battalion-sized and even bigger sweeps to try and take out the terrorists. And as what happens in Vietnam later on, these are abject failures, and there's no real results, and it's just a really poorly mishandled sort of thing until 1950 when they actually do appoint a director of operations.
So, Michael, you mentioned that, and it's called the Malayan Emergency. Why was it called an emergency and not a war?
This is purely down to insurance. The mine owners and the plantation owners would not have been paid out for insurance if it had been called a war. So it was called an emergency instead, so that when their rubber trees or their tin mines got clocked, they could actually put in an insurance claim to the British government to get some recompense. So purely monetary. So,
geez, it's
absolutely. So,
what's the old saying, Michael? It's politics and money. It's always that's two things that always seem to come up in most discussions on wars.
Absolutely, and religion certainly plays its part as well. But yeah, in this case, it's mainly ethnic tensions, and cash does play a little bit, but also mismanagement of politics.
So, what did the Australian Army play in Malaya, and were the jungle fighting skills that were developed during the Second World War, put into use in Malaya with equal success, or was this a different type of fighting?
Yeah, the Australian Army doesn't arrive in Malaya until 1955, late 1955, which is when 2RAR is sent over. And they don't actually deploy onto the Malayan mainland until early 56, and they're on operations for there. But by this stage, the counterinsurgency is being well and truly run as it should have been, with that Hearts and Minds sort of campaign being run on the mainland, separating the communist terrorists or the Malayan National Liberation Army from its source of food and materials. And this is where you get those new villages or new settlements which don't work in Vietnam but work in Malaya. They separate their food resources and their supporter base from the jungle, and they do that reasonably successfully. But this is done through the implementation of the Harold Briggs plan. Harold Briggs was the first director of operations in 1950 that got in and set up the basically how we're going to run this insurgency. And it's Gerald Templer that takes over. Sir Gerald Templer that takes over in 1952, who is able to implement Briggs's plan of that fighting that counterinsurgency, not with big battalion sweeps, but smaller unit actions. Major focus on intelligence gathering, and the smart use of intelligence to outsmart and interdict enemy action and things like that. So there's a real change in how warfighting happens from those big unit actions of the late 1940s in Malaya to these smaller unit patrols and patrolling to contact sort of actions, but major focus on police work, intelligence work, and things like that. So it's a smarter war. But the Australians, when they get to Malaya, almost have to learn a whole lot of new lessons. It's guys who've served in the independent companies in the Second World War who are fighting not quite a counterinsurgency, but still not quite set piece battles either. They're fighting the smarter jungle war rather than the big set piece battles against the Japanese, which the main army or the AOF is fighting. But they still have to learn lessons that the British have picked up and even Australian observers have picked up. And there's a jungle warfare school which is set up at Kotatingi, which is then where the Australians go through and get schooled up on what's going on in Malaya to fight that sort of counterinsurgency type war when they actually do start deploying. And the war certainly isn't won in '56 when 2 RAAF deploy into the jungles, but they certainly have a few early setbacks with it's a bit of an oxymoron, but friendly fire incidents, and even their early patrolling was a little bit fraught, you could say, by with inexperience mainly. But they certainly learn as they go along, and the contacts aren't constant, but they learn some pretty hard lessons as well, because the communist terrorists have been fighting for years, and they know their ground. They're on home ground, and they give the Australians a few bloody noses throughout the early years as well.
So was it very like what I'm gathering from what I'm listening to and what you're telling me is so light skirmishes and sort of like those sort of type like quick fire contacts and then retreat, and then that's sort of the fighting in the early stages.
Yeah, you see that with the Australians especially. They go from, it's mainly platoon actions, platoon patrols with company bases and things like that, and even down to the point where you're having individual sections patrolling in certain areas and are able to come to each other's aid, as did happen with the pipeline ambush when patrol of the Australians got ambushed, and two of the initial section were killed. And another member of one of the rescuing sections was killed as they encountered the CTs as well. And there was only a couple of CTs killed, but they actually inflicted more damage on the Australians before withdrawing. But these are small patrol actions. These aren't the major set piece battles that you're sort of seeing in Korea, which is the last conventional war. And then it's all been sort of those counterinsurgencies or small wars after that. And it's certainly not the big set pieces you see in the Second World War either. So this is all patrol bases, artillery off patrol bases in support of its patrols, but mainly just sections and new platoons out patrolling the jungle, trying to encounter the CTs and either capture, kill, or drive them away.
So you mentioned like we'd gone away from sort of the trench warfare of World War One and early World War Two, and just the constant movement. Like it was like Malaya was very similar to Vietnam in the sense of keep always moving, like patrolling, trying to seek the enemy out, find where they are, and so it's very different to the early conflicts, isn't it?
Yeah, you've got the Australians are mainly operating around Perak or in the Perak area, and they're trying to drive the CTs up towards the Thai border. And a lot of the CTs by this stage are actually operating from bases within Thailand and are coming into Perak from Thailand. So the Australians are involved in that latter stage of the conflict where they're pushing the CTs out of Perak to the Thai border and then across, but then are patrolling the border later on. So in 1957, 2 RAAF are replaced by 3, and then in 1959, 1 RAAF go across, and then 3 come back in '63. But there's a few of the rotations of the battalions through before they go into a different conflict. But the emergency is declared over in 1960, but there's still the Australians are invited to stay by the Malayans, but they are involved in that patrol warfare up along the Thai border by 1960. So, and that's where they stay for the rest of it as well, into 65 when obviously the confrontation's on. But by 1955 as well, also before the Australians get in, the Malayan Communist Party under Chin Peng have tried to have an armistice negotiation meeting with Tunku Abdul Rahman, who is the head of the Malaya. And he basically says, no, we're not dealing with the communists. We don't want you guys in our party. And basically we are not going to deal with you in any meaningful way. And Chin Peng's wanting to sort of extend that olive branch, but with a recognition for the communists at the political table, and that's not going to wash with the Malayans at all. So the war continues in that regard. But you've also got one of the things that Malayans are also hanging on is when the British had first gotten back into Malaya after the war, there's not that initial attempt to get federation straight away. And it's sort of a carrot on a stick. But when Gerald Templer comes in 52, the first thing he does is put Malaya's federation straight on the table. So the Malayans know that the British mean business. They're not there to try and stay there and have their empire still. They're actually actively pushing for Malayan independence. And that happens in 1957. So, which basically takes all the reason for the communist involvement or communist fighting. Takes all the wind out of that sail, and yet the communists still fight on because they still want that communist controlled state, basically, of Malaya, and that doesn't happen. And even though in 1960 the Malayan the communist terrorists aren't defeated, I mean they're much reduced, but a lot of them are still over in Thailand and still have their weapons. And in 1968, they have another crack, and there's a second Malayan emergency which goes on until 1989. So, it's phenomenal. But yeah, the Australians have that smaller involvement with Rifle Company Butterworth and things like that, but and also an Air Force presence as well. But yeah.
So obviously, Michael, you hear from the Second World War that the Australians suffered tropical diseases and a lot of jungle diseases. Was that the same in Malaya? Do we know that there was a lot of jungle diseases in the fighting in Malaya?
Yeah, you can certainly see the medical reports when you look through the battalion diaries that tropical prickly heat, tropical diseases, or through heat stress, all sorts of things, the tinea, all the different body rashes and things like that come up. They are susceptible. The Australians are susceptible to the deprivations of the jungle when you're out there on patrol for a long time. They do get weakened by the exposure to the tropical heat, the lack of decent food, and it does have an effect on the body. So intestinal complaints and things like that. So it certainly is there are medical issues that have plagued veterans of that conflict as well.
So with as you said, the Malayan Emergency, it started in 1948 and ran through to 1960. Why, we came in 1955. Why did it seem? Was it just like a toing and throwing, and why did it seem to go on for so long?
I think it's initially, you can look at the political mishandling of a few things with the British, especially early on, but they're getting the counterinsurgency period quite right. So that smaller unit fighting, but it then becomes the political machinations between the communists with predominantly Chinese and the Malayan people who don't want the communists in the country at all. And it's just that mainly the combat conflict, but also the political conflict between the communists and the Malay people who are diametrically opposed to one another, and that's what continues it on. And just the intractability on both sides often was what continued the conflict, and even in a smaller way, but it just kept it going.
What role did the RAAF and the Royal Australian Navy play in Malaya?
Yeah, one squadron, as I mentioned before, were in for quite a while, and they were the initial air power for the British. And it's been said of one squadron's efforts that they basically terrorised rubber trees, but there's a lot more to one squadron's role than just bombing jungle. They were actually trying to bomb the CT camps, and they almost got Chin Peng on one occasion as well, and took out a fair number of his people that were in camp with him. But they're actively trying to destabilise the rat lines or the routes between the villages and the camps. Bombing these basically access routes for the CTs in and out of habited areas, and so basically causing fear for the CTs as they moved around. So one squadron actually did have that effect, and when the operations moved into that sort of that big army sort of style of things, the Lincoln bombers were actually able to fly low and slow and able to do precision bombing as well. So they were actually quite a useful tool for the British to do precision bombing, and they were then replaced in 1958 by Number 2 Squadron, which were then equipped with the English Electric Canberra bombers. And the Canberras were they saw their first service in the emergency, or the later stages of the emergency. And you've got Number 3 Squadron and 77 Squadron as well, also flying in the emergency as well, with the CAC Sabre jets, which were a pretty superior fighter jet at that stage for the Australians. But the world's moving beyond with fighters. But again, the Sabres do see patrol action or aerial patrols as well. And the Navy also sees some action shelling shore targets, but also providing that police presence, or that not police presence, it's a poor term, but that presence of interdicting seaborne traffic that's trying to stop or trying to resupply the Malayans or the CTs, and just providing that presence of patrolling, stopping any sort of resupply operations by sea where possible, and firing ship-to-shore targets as well, and that happened on a couple of occasions as well. So they certainly have that major presence up there as well.
So, and like you spoke about the flying capacity with the squadrons, and that ramped up a lot more during Vietnam, didn't it? Like that started to change a lot more, and the tactics of bringing like fighting in the jungles. But you could say that it was really started in Korea and then brought forward into Malaya and then into Vietnam.
Yeah, you can see a lot of that jungle precision bombing. Sort of, you see that in the Pacific during the Second World War, where you've got the Army and the Air Force working quite cohesively a lot to get bombing on targets or fighter straps or things like that to work in that cohesive manner to try and defeat the Japanese. And you've got that going on in Europe as well, with the bombers and the fighters and attacking sort of German formations and things like that as well. But in a jungle sense, you certainly see that in the Pacific against the Japanese, with the RAAF and the USAF and USAAF, sorry, to combat the Japanese in that cooperative manner. And that does go on then through Korea. You get the air-to-ground operations going in Korea, Malaya confrontation as well, and then into Vietnam. So they adapt it and change it as required as they go on, and adapt the lessons where needed.
So, Michael, how many Australians served during the emergency, and what was our casualty figures by the end of the emergency?
Yeah, there's the combat casualties aren't what we'd call high as far as our casualties go. But when you look at the actual overall deaths, the emergency leads to the deaths of more than 10,000 people, of which 6,700 of those are CTs. And then you've got over 1,300 dead of the British Commonwealth Forces. That's the Malayan Army and Police Forces, and 519 British Commonwealth Forces. 39 Australians killed or died as a result of their service, and fewer than half of those, only around about 15 of those are combat related, and 29 are wounded in combat. But of the Australians, I don't know an exact figure of to hand. I don't think. Just see if I've got it on my notes of Australians who served in Malaya, because you've got the Navy up there as part of the Far East Strategic Reserve as well, as that sort of anti-communist deterrent to China. But yeah, there's some thousands when you look at 1, 2, and 3 RAR going back for a second stint, plus the Air Force and the Navy. So I can't give you an exact figure. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay, mate. It just interests me to know. Like, obviously, Korea, we had 17,000 fight over there, and Malaya being, like, I thought it roughly, if we have a guess, what would you say, Michael? This is just a purely guess. 5,000, would you say? Would
6,000 would probably be a fair accurate figure.
Yep, yeah, and that's with obviously including the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army on the ground. 5,000 or 6,000, you would say. So, and like we said at the start, that's essentially, I guess that why Korea and Malaya are sort of forgotten with, that we had so many more serve in Vietnam, and I think the figure is 65,000 that served
Yeah,
in.
they're
Yeah.
around 65,000.
So a lot more involved in Vietnam than there are in Korea and Malaya, but still as important. Their service is service regardless. We should be talking about Korea and Malaya a little bit more, in my opinion, and that's why I got you on to talk about it,
Yeah,
because
absolutely, and the confrontation veterans as well, because there's those three very closely linked conflicts with that decolonization Asia before Vietnam. We get there as well, but we, even though we're a fledgling, or not fledgling, but a very small force, and politically our commitments to those forces are very targeted, or very considered. They're not really trying to escalate or commit too much, and there's just not the people power to do that at this stage either. So it's a very political motivation to sort of have those smaller commitments to these wars in Asia, and until Vietnam, when it's the Americans are really sort of needing more boots on the ground, and we're very much trying to keep America in our region by inviting ourselves to this war. But and in so doing, that big war overshadows Korea, Malaya, and Indonesia as well. So it's and these veterans do need their memories kept alive. It's
absolutely, and I know you've spoken to many, and are they like forward coming to you, like when you're trying to talk to them, and are they pretty giving in what they want to share with you, or are they a little bit more reserved?
Yeah, some of the Malayan veterans and some of the confrontation veterans I've spoken to are a little bit more reserved. The Korean guys are just happy that people are wanting to recognise their service even this late in the piece. And I think that the South Korean government have actually treated our veterans better than we have by a country mile. But when you talk to the Malayan and Indonesian veterans, they're a little bit more hesitant to talk about what they were doing, and why they were over there. And they will talk, but it's more, oh yeah, we were just over there and we did a job. But there's so much more to it than that, and they were actually over there doing a pretty spectacular job. And they should never sell themselves short. And I mean, it's not just people like me, but the other members of the Australian community and the historical community that are very much interested in their stories and what they did and what their actions led to. And it really, the formation of Malaysia as it stands today happened because of their involvement in some way, even in a small way. They played their part in allowing that to happen, or bringing that to happen. So they can't sell themselves short in any way, shape, or form.
Absolutely, and as I said to you off air, and service is service regardless. A bullet in Malaya or a bullet in Vietnam doesn't matter; it can still kill you
Absolutely.
regardless. So, and I think it's important to note that service is service, regardless of where you fight, or in anywhere around the world. So
And
there's still the same dangers.
it happened in Malaya as well. There's Charlie Anderson, who was a sergeant in Malaya when he was killed. He had served in the independent companies in the Second World War, had done a bit of time in Beikoff, had been in 3 RAR during its initial charge up the Korean Peninsula before he was wounded, came back into the battalion after his wounds, then fought at Mariang San, stayed in the army post that, and then was at 2 RAR. And he's an Indigenous man as well. And he's then killed during an ambush in the early stages in Malaya. And he's actually still, while he's bleeding out, trying to run this combat, and he dies as he's carried out. But 3 war veteran, and it happens there. It happens again in Vietnam with guys who'd served in Korea, and it's one of those things that these guys are seeing multiple wars, and you've got people like Len Opie, who serves at the end of the Second World War. I think it was with the Second 14th Battalion. Then he's BCOP. Then he's 3 RAR in Korea. He goes through, I think, confrontation as well, then Vietnam, and not only with the training here, but then he's doing clandestine ops with the CIA and stuff like that as well. So there's guys that go through multiple wars and actually see pretty much from 44, 45 onwards to 75. I mean, there's some significant service from these Australians. throughout this period of time. And it's unbelievable for my tiny little brain. So,
Absolutely, and it's great that to get you on and shine a light on these men. Some of them, as you say, that served from late 1945 right through to 75. Like there's a long history there of that, like that men really started as boy soldiers, you would say, and by the time they discharge, they've gone through multiple wars. They're seasoned veterans. Like they've seen some hard fighting.
yeah, very much so. And we still have that link to Malaysia today with the Rifle Company at Butterworth. And that's a legacy of the Malayan Emergency as well. And I mean, we had the RAAF, which is now at I think it's Penang. Sorry, the RAAF. Oh, sorry, the RAAF base at Butterworth, which is now the Singapore Air Force and Malayan Air Force. Sorry, that holds that. But we had a RAAF presence there for until 75, and the Rifle Company presence has stayed since the end of the drawdown of forces out of Vietnam as well. But it's we still have that link to our service in Malaya, and it's one of those things that as each rifle company rotates through, there is that history and that linkage to that period of our time, and still that link to what we were thinking of at the time politically with forward defence and that deterrent to communism. And you look at it these days and you think how close the not the enemy but the Chinese are to the doorstep and are right on it. And there was something in forward defence, even though it was politically on the nose by 1975. But having that active military deterrent, but even with the non-government aid agencies and things like that operating in the Pacific until the late 90s, early 2000s, when they were drawn out, and it's just allowed that creep in reverse back to our doorstep. And seeing how it plays out, it's quite interesting.
So, Michael, what was the overall outcome of the Malayan Emergency, and what actually happened? It wasn't like the end of the Second World War. What actually happened?
Yeah, I mean, you've got when Tunku Abdul Rahman declared the emergency over in July 1960. It's the old thing of the enemy still isn't 100% defeated. So the CTs are across the border. Chin Peng isn't captured. He's still active and out. But for all intents and purposes, the terrorists have been pushed to the Thai border, so they're not actually causing great ruckus in the rest of Malaysia. So when Rahman declares the war or the conflict, sorry, the emergency over, it's still technically going, but it's just one of those things that goes on. And as I was saying earlier on, it boils over into a second emergency from 68 to 89. When Chin Peng realizes that the dream is never going to happen and throws in the towel. But it's basically the goal of the the current Malaysians were to have a federated state which is independent of Britain, which they got in 57, and basically were able to maintain that without any sort of white-handing or sort of ongoing insurgency by the communists. The one that did, the insurgency that did happen was in a very small way, which didn't actually concern them post 1962 too much. It was then the focus then became Indonesia, or what was the new Indonesia, looking at Malaysia, or what was the what do you call it, Sabah and Sarawak on Borneo, which was part of Malaysia. Wanting to incorporate that into Indonesia, and so trying to destabilize this new federation became the next conflict that the Malaysians then had to face. So it was a rolling conflict in a way.
So, in your opinion, Michael, the Malayan Emergency, was it just that we got involved? In your opinion, or was it really, looking back at it now, is it something that we should have stayed out of? What's your opinion on it?
No, I think it's something that when you look at what's going on with the rise of communism and the communist states in Asia during that late 40s, early 50s period, the Menzies government was staunchly anti-communist and were very keen. They were facing basically tried to ban the Communist Party in Australia as well at the time, and there was that McCarthyism in the 50s of the Reds under the bed and all that going on. But the domino theory and that many people argue that it didn't exist, or it wasn't a thing. But when you actually have people, the former leader of Singapore saying we actually feared the rise of communism in our particular area, and looking at Malaya in particular, there was that real fear of the rise of communism in Asia actually dominating or becoming the dominant force, and Australia becoming this island in a sea of red, so to speak. So I think we did have a place supporting Britain and also supporting the Malay people as well, fighting the communists, and also being able to establish their own federated nation as part of that as well. So I think, yeah, we did have a place in Malaya to assist them into their federated state.
So, was there any gallantry awards for the fighting over in Malaya that we know of?
There are no VCs, but there's certainly minor awards, MMs and things like that. So they're again not that many, but they certainly did were awarded. But yeah, they're not again not as widely recognised or written about as you say the modern VC recipients, and even the guys from Vietnam, where you've got guys sort of looking at those retrospective awards as well. But it's again, people just accepted what they got, and it was even though it was a smaller conflict, there was still some gallantry awards handed up.
So, a lot of the men who fought in Malaya obviously went on and fought in Vietnam, and was the terrain that they faced and the jungle fighting that was in Malaya, was it similar in Vietnam?
In places, yes, but also quite different in other places as well. But some of the tactics they'd learnt in Malaya, as the patrolling and the way they operated in the jungle, was transferable into that jungle environment in Vietnam. But the politics and the enemy had changed. So where the Chinese or the predominantly Chinese communist terrorists were not, they did not enjoy home ground advantage as such in Malaya. They were able to be separated from the Malayan people, and then their own support network through bribes, through citizenship, through buying houses and becoming part of that Malayan infrastructure. They were able to separate the CTs from their support base. Whereas in Vietnam, they're trying to fight they're bringing that insurgent mentality or emergency mentality with them to the jungles in Vietnam. But what they're trying to do with the hamlets and things like that isn't working, because they're separating farmers from their traditional lands and their crop areas, and basically creating more insurgents and not really understanding the Vietnamese culture and mindset is completely different to the Malayan mindset as well. So it's that real lack of understanding of Asian culture and Asian mentality and in each different nation, and that unwillingness to sort of not everybody. I mean, there's people who actually really did try and learn the lessons, and you'd see that with special forces learnings and even battalion learnings where they really are trying to win the hearts and minds. But even then, it's not really done properly in Vietnam. The people are getting schools where they may need wells, or they're getting you see Up Sui Nay, the little hamlet town which is created when the task force base goes into Phuc Tuy. It's got lined streets and all the rest of it, and the town still exists. But that town created more support for the Viet Cong than it stopped, because these people again had taken out of their fields and their area at Nui Dat to go to Ap Sui Nay. So it's a real lack of understanding of what's needed to defeat this insurgency. So the lessons learnt didn't always equate to the right lessons being brought forward to the next conflict.
So we mentioned at the start of the podcast, and Korea and Malaya are the forgotten conflicts in Australia's history to a lesser sense. And I say that, and there'll be some people out there, Michael, that'll say, Adam, what are you talking about? You know, we remember all wars, but it seems to be that the lesser Korea and Malaya are forgotten in that's what the general census. So I believe that, and I know you sort of agree with that, and the veterans do themselves as well. They believe that. Why, in your opinion, why do you think that is, and what more needs to be done to remember the Korean and Malayan veterans who fought?
Yeah, I think what we're doing now, talking about their service, doing podcasts, and even things like when we have major ceremonies like Anzac Day, whilst the First World War and Second World War and Vietnam are always going to be the major ones, plus the modern conflicts, there's that period of time between 50 and sort of 65 as we start to impact into Vietnam, where three very different but also quite linked conflicts take place. And it's doing things like these podcasts and talking about their memories, writing articles, writing books, and getting them out into the public domain, and even the academic journals and things like that. But it's what we do here in this sort of public face that actually people who listen to the podcast, or people who read our magazine Wartime, or people who do other methods of sort of with the TV journalism and things like that, just to try and highlight these people's stories and their service and sacrifice and what they did, is a great way to try and highlight it. And I mean, we've done a lot in the last 10 years, especially, to really put Korea back on the map, or our veteran community back on the map, as far as what we commemorate and how we commemorate their service. And we're still not getting quite right with the emergency and confrontation veterans, even though we've tried that as well. But it's just getting it to take in the wider public memory that where it sort of falls down. But one of the things where it never really falls down, from my experience, is within the Defence Force itself. Both, or not, Army, Navy, and Air Force, all the units have that lineage of history, and they always take the history forward, and always remember the different battles, the different actions, the different wars that they've been in. Being able to talk to some of the COs of the Royal Australian Regiment, they get together as much as possible every year for a Charlie Green dinner. And he's the first and only CO of the Royal Australian Regiment that's been killed on active operations. So they not only remember units, but they remember individuals who set the bar in a way for the rest of sort of modern history of the ADF, what became the ADF. The Defence Force today doesn't forget its history. So on that front, they're never forgotten.
I think too, Michael, is it because obviously, we've done so much on the First World War, and you can go and visit Gallipoli, you can go and visit the Western Front, you can go and walk Kokoda, you can go to Hellfire Pass, you can, and then in Vietnam also you can go to the battlefields and walk them. Is it because in Malaya they're lesser known and you can't get to these places where they were fought, or is it because it was little skirmishes? Is it harder to go and actually walk that ground?
You could probably get there. It's probably a lot more difficult than because I've not been to Malaysia yet, and I've been to Vietnam a few times leading tours over there and being on study tours. But that's reasonably accessible for the tourists. But I'm sure you could get up to places in Perak where some of these contacts happened, and even if you go into Sabah and Sarawak and actually have a look at some of the places where some of the forward bases were during the confrontation. So, Google mapping some of these areas now, they're little towns that have grown up where these forward bases were, so you can actually get to them, but it's a little bit more difficult, say, for the normal battlefield tourist than say, yeah, as you're saying before, Gallipoli, the Western Front, Vietnam, and even Israel, places like that where we've served. It's probably a little bit more difficult to get to some of these places, but where there's a will,
yeah, where there's a will, there's a way, and I think it'd be fascinating ground to like you can still these battlefields, they talk to us, Michael. I recently mentioned to you that I've just come back from the Western Front, and although it's just like back to farming land, and you can only imagine what went on during the First World War. The battlefields still talk to you. They still bring up relics and things in the ground, and it's you go and you walk this ground, and you just try and imagine what these men went through. And it'd be the same in Vietnam. It's the same in Malaya. It's the same wherever you go. you can read about it, but it's another thing to walk this ground. And I think you're right. It'd be fascinating once you do get on the ground in Malaya that you could actually go and see these forward bases and see some of where the fighting was.
Yeah, and even though they're towns now, you can sort of get that GPS coordinate sort of points from the war diaries and things like that. But you're right. I mean, you can see even up in the long high hills that overlook Bungtower, you can still see remnants of arc light strikes from B-52s with split granite boulders and things like that. And as you were saying before, when you're even driving through some of the urban areas or suburban or paddock areas, farm areas in Belgium, you can see some of the farmers' dams are actually shell holes. And it's just, you look at it and go, that the mind boggles. I mean, Israel, it's not so prevalent because there's so much old history, but the First World War history is sort of non-existent because all those battlefields have been picked over, and if it's not in a museum, it's just not there. But you can see the hill where the slope where the light horse came down at the end of the day on the 31st of October, and you can go out to Megiddo where the big Megiddo offensive went through in 1918, and out to the Simak railway station, which is part of an Israeli university now. But all these different sites where you can actually go and eyeball them, and you're right that they do speak to you, and it's really evocative. And seeing how many times that some of these places have actually had wars fought over them. Standing at a place called Ashkelon on the beach in Israel, and with a friend who I was with at the time who was part of the tour group, he was saying Richard III came ashore here. Like, hell, yes, he did. But then you've got Thutmose III from the Egyptian Empire going through the Levant as well. And as the Egyptian Empire reaches sort of or builds towards its peak, it's fought over so many times. And the same thing in Malaya. You've got the Japanese who swept down the peninsula in 1941 and driven the Australians and the British and everybody else back down to Singapore. And then only years later, they're back there as fighting again against the communist terrorists. And all these areas have had multiple wars fought over them and throughout history as well. And it's, they do speak. And
Absolutely, and I think it's just fascinating, mate. That's why you and I are passionate about military history, because it's just fascinating to learn the history that's, and as you said, it's that a lot of these battlefields have been fought over for centuries, and they'll probably be fought over again in the future. Who knows? And that's the thing of, unfortunately, Michael, with wars, we seem to be not learning from our past of what happens in wars, so they just continually keep happening, but it's just in a different geographical location. So
really, and sometimes it's the same location but with just different technology, but the same result.
That's right.
Afghanistan being a case in point. I mean, the British got thoroughly towed up in there, and the Russians and anybody else that's been in there prior to the last lot, it all ends the same way.
That's right. And and every veteran, as you know, every veteran we've both spoken to say the same thing. No one wins. There's no winners in war. There's just a lot of pain and suffering, which is, and it's unfortunately it's a true sense in the word of war that there's pain and suffering, and there's no winners, and it's unfortunate, but there'll be wars until, forever. I think there's just not gonna, I don't think you'll ever see peace in the world, unfortunately.
Yeah, no. Whenever a country has a military, they're going to want to use it at some point in time, or it's especially the big ones.
That's right. So, what else, Michael, is there that we can do from an Australian perspective, and is it that we see that for Malaya that we get accounts of on Anzac Day and Remembrance Day of the veterans that served over there, or what else can be done in Australia?
Well, I think one of the things that we don't have the resources for at the War Memorial is getting out to the remote areas and actually chatting to veterans, and for family members to be able to sit down and talk with their relatives if they're willing, and just gently encourage them to share these stories before they're lost to time, and just share the memories of what they did, how they did it. And it doesn't always have to be about the fighting and the dying. I mean, one of the things I really love talking about with veterans is what sort of music were you listening to and you hear blokes not so much in the front line, my guys in Korea especially, but when they're at the back, Camp Casey and places like that, they had gramophones and the records from home and Armed Forces Radio USA, and talking about the different hits they were listening to. What did you eat? What did you carry? What sort of equipment? And sort of listening to everybody, pardon me, bitch and moan about having the old British kit and then wishing for they get the American stuff. And then when they get the American stuff, they're like, oh, this isn't all it cracked up to be either. But it just sort of getting that understanding of what they carried, what they did, day-to-day routines, the fear of being under fire, I guess, and sort of that, and it just all these sort of things, and it just starts to, as you get people laughing and more relaxed and sort of talking about the lighter part of their service, they can actually confront the darker parts a bit more easily, because they're sort of relaxing their mind away and sort of talking about the lighter hearted sort of aspects. And some don't want to go down the dark path, and that's fair enough. I mean, yeah, when the black dog bites, it certainly does, and you need to be very much aware of that. And yeah, triggering veterans, I accidentally triggered an Iraq veteran when I was interviewing him for a history at work, and that set me off as well. And I was mortified that I did that, and it was purely accident. So you always have to tread very very warily, but with the utmost respect.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more with that, mate. Especially when I've spoken to veterans as well. I never ever want to bring pain or suffering to them, and I don't push things, and I feel I've got a good balance. I can understand the questions to ask and the questions not to ask, and I don't push something if they don't want to talk about it. It's you go by them, and it's a very different interviewing someone like you, a historian, to a veteran. It's a totally, I come in with a totally different angle and a totally different, it's a totally different style of how I interview.
Very much, yeah. I mean, whilst I wore a uniform, I never went away anywhere, and it's just one of those things that you just rock up and you do your job. And yeah, I mean, I always take my hat off to the people that actually went and went overseas and did their job, and in that regard. And yeah, it's just how you talk to them, and seeing them come back, especially friends who've gone away and come back completely different, and it's how you deal with them, and just be there for them. And it's yeah, as you said, it's a totally different way you speak to them.
Absolutely.
Before, so.
Absolutely. So, Michael, what are you currently working on, and what projects have you got coming up in the future?
Yeah, at the moment, I'm as part of my other duties as not just writing about Korea and the post 45. I run our wartime magazine from the management perspective. So, getting the next couple of issues up and running for next year. We've got 101, which will be out in January, which is looking at code breakers and agent running and things like that. So looking at from the early aspects of intelligence gathering and use from the Royal Australian Navy in 14. I contributed an article on a chap who was on his second tour in Korea in 53 and running Korean agents up behind Chinese lines right before the end of the war. And one of my friends has also written about how ASIO spied on returned Australian prisoners from Korea in case they might have been communists. So we've got a real broad range of topics, looking at Ultra and Enigma in the desert and Crete, places like that. So it's a really interesting issue. But yeah, I have great fun bringing that to life every quarter, and also going to get drawn into the gallery development next year in some small way as well. So and my great hope is that I'll get to play a major part in the development of the or redevelopment of the post 1945 galleries when they come up in a few years' time for a redo as well. So plenty coming up.
A lot happening for you, mate. A lot happening. And well, Michael, it's been an absolute honour and a privilege to have you on, mate, to talk about Malaya and just shine a bit of light, as I said, shine light on Malaya and the Malayan veterans. And I just want to thank you for the work that you continually are doing. And mate, we'll definitely get you back on the podcast again. It's been absolutely great to have you on just to talk about it.
Thanks very much, Adam. It's been a real honour and privilege for me to be with you as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast on whatever platform you get your podcasts.